yeah, it's not just the first time that they're sisters on stage at the Polyglot conference, but after 50 years of language learning and 30 years of language teaching, it's actually the first time that we're presenting together. So it's a personal first for us as well. So thank you ever so much for inviting us, Richard and Alex.
My name's Ana Beaven, and I teach English at the University of Bologna in Italy.
And I am Tita Beaven, yo enseño español at the Open University in the United Kingdom. And we both have an interest in teaching adults at the Open University. It's a distance university, and the average age of our students is around 40. And we also both have an interest in teaching not just in formal contexts, but also in informal contexts. And one of the ways of thinking about how people learn in informal contexts is to look at self-directed learning. And there are a number of models that talk about how students learn in this way. And so we're just going to cover them very briefly to start with. Perhaps the best known writer about self-directed learning, I don't know whether you know, is Knowles. And he talks about self-directed learning as a process in which individuals take the initiative, with or without the help of others, in diagnosing their learning needs, and then in formulating their learning goals, in identifying the resources, the materials that they can use for learning, whether these are other humans or whether they are books or any other materials, and choosing and implementing the strategies that they're going to use, and then also, finally, very importantly, in evaluating their learning outcomes. So his model is very simple, and I'm sure you recognize some of this in the way that you learn. Diagnosing your learning needs, formulating those needs, identifying the resources you're going to use for learning, thinking of the strategies, and then, as I said, evaluating your outcomes. Another model that we wanted to talk to you about very briefly is a model by Long, who produced this model in the 90s, and he talks about learner control. And he talks about two dimensions of learner control. On the one hand, the psychological dimension of the control that you have over your learning, which is, for instance, to do with your motivation. And on the other hand, the pedagogical dimension that you have over your learning. And as you see, that's to do with your goals, with the activities that you plan, with the resources that you use, with the deadlines that you set for yourself, and so on. The theory that we wanted to focus on is one by a Canadian academic called Bouchard. And he is very interested in the idea of what is pedagogy when there is no teacher. What happens when you learn without a teacher? So he actually looked at Long's theories and sort of questioned them slightly, reformulated them. And he said that actually psychology is maybe a very broad term to use, and that really we should be thinking in particular about what is it that makes somebody want to start a learning process. And he also questioned the use of pedagogy in the sense that pedagogy is what a teacher does, not what the learner does. And as I said, he was interested to find out, how learners learn when there is no teacher. So he came up. He was also, obviously, he's writing a lot later than the other two authors that we just mentioned. And he was also very interested in finding out what happens in an online network learning environment. Because, of course, in such environments, learners have control over what they learn and why they learn, of course, but also where they learn, how they learn, and the cost, and so on, and with whom they learn. So all of a sudden, the learner has a lot more control when you learn online than when you just attend, for instance, a class. So he, as I said, he reworked Long's model, and he came up with 4 dimensions of self-directed learning. And the first 2 at the top are to do with your autonomy as a learner. So as I said, the psychological dimension he reformulated as a cognitive dimension is what he called it. And basically this is all the reasons that you can have for wanting to learn, so your drive, your motivation, your impulses, your initiative, and so on. Then he came up with a very hideous term, I think, algorithmic dimension, to talk about the pedagogic dimension, so basically the sequence of what you learn. And then he added these other two dimensions at the bottom, which are to do with the new environments in which people learn, so the online learning environments. So he talked about the semiotic dimension, so the resources that we have available to learn, and of course they are no longer the sort of old-fashioned print and audio that we had 50 years ago, but also all the resources and the people that we have access to when we study online, when we learn online. And he's also very interested in the economic dimension, so not just, you know, in this new era of abundance of pedagogical resources, where there's so much that is free, where the people still are paying for their learning, but also what the value of that learning is. And so whether learners who learn in these contexts still see value, for instance, in learning in an institution where you get an accreditation, for instance. So why is it that so many I imagine you, but a lot of the informal learners that I have met also take formal exams, for instance. So there's a value to that sort of formal accreditation of your learning. Okay. So these are the four dimensions that provide a framework to which we can look at self-directed learning. And they are the basis of a research study that we have carried out amongst a specific language learning community. And this language learning community is the Add1Challenge. And we just wanted to say a very big thank you to Brian Kwong, who started the Add1Challenge and who also allowed us to do this research. He facilitated the contact with the participants. And Brian has now moved to pastures new, so he's no longer in charge of the Add1Challenge, but it is now in the very capable hands of Benny Lewis and his team. I don't know whether Benny is here, but yay, hi. Okay, can I just ask you, how many of you have heard of the Add1Challenge? Can you put your hands up? Great, way. And keep your hands up if you have done the Add1Challenge once. And if you've done it more than once? Great, okay. So bear with me while I just very briefly talk about what the Add1Challenge involves. The Add1Challenge is a community of around 700 learners at the moment who engage in cohorts that vary from about 40 to about 100 in a particular challenge. And the challenge is to study a language for 90 days. And the specific aim of the challenge, as you can see, is at the end of the 90 days to be able to hold a 15-minute conversation with a native speaker. The community has a website that I'll show you in a minute where they communicate, but they also communicate primarily through a private Facebook group. And this is it. And this is through the Facebook group, the organizers post sort of reminders of what needs to be done, but also the community, it's a space where the community talks to each other and supports each other. So the Add1Challenge is not a sort of free-for-all where you do whatever for 90 days and hope that at the end you can have a conversation. It's actually very structured. The part of the structure is that when you apply to do the Add1Challenge, you need to do a video explaining why you want to do it and also saying something in the language that is your target language. And then you also post a video at day 30, day 60, and day 90. And these videos are public, so everybody in the community and beyond can see these videos and offers encouragement and feedback on your progress. The other important aspect of the challenge is that for the first 30 days, you have to commit to a non-negotiable routine. You set the routine up, so you can decide, for instance, for the first month, I'm going to spend 4 days a week, half an hour a day, studying this language, and you commit to that, and you do it for the first month. And then you can actually adjust this in subsequent months. The challenge also includes, in between those videos, there are some mini challenges that in a way sort of mark the pace. And I think part of the aim of these mini challenges is as well to encourage you to try new things. Okay, this is one of the pages of the website, and this is the tracker. And as you can see, this is 4 participants in the challenge, in the particular challenge that we studied. The first one, there's absolutely nothing for them because they dropped out. There's quite a high dropout rate in the challenge. And what you do is for every day, you say whether you have had a yay or a nay, so whether you have been successful in what you set out to do or not. And obviously, if it's a day where you weren't planning to do anything, you just mark it as a break. And you see in the gray corner there, you can also make a note of what it is you have been doing. And I certainly found this very useful, not just to keep track of what I was doing, to be able to review it afterwards, but also to see what other people were doing and to get ideas from them. The other aspect, the sort of more social aspect, if you want, of the challenge is that you have 2 groups that you belong to. One is your study group. So the study group is people who are studying the same language as you, and you're encouraged to meet regularly and to practice the language and to share resources and ideas. And the other group is the mastermind group, which are people who might be studying another language, but basically this is your accountability buddies. So every week you check on each other and you check that, that everything is going fine. I think maybe the only other thing is that at the end of the 90 days, then those that have survived the challenge and posted their final video, there's a sort of competition to choose the winner of the challenge. So there's an element of gamification, so you get points for doing all sorts of things, but at the end, basically, everybody who has completed the challenge is entered for this sort of final, and you have to explain what you got out of the challenge, and the community votes for the winner, not necessarily based on the progress you have made in your language, but also in your participation in the community. And there's a prize. The prize has been, I don't know whether it still is, that you get a flight to a country where your language is spoken. So that's the ultimate goal, I suppose, for a lot of people who do this challenge. Okay. So our study involved the learners in this particular challenge, Add1Challenge 24, that took place last summer. And we did 2 things. On the one hand, we sent them all a questionnaire, and we asked them about their motivation for doing the challenge. We also asked them about their prior learning experience, both learning independently and also learning languages. And we also asked them about their preferred strategies for language learning. And then we asked for volunteers to interview them during the challenge. We had 11 volunteers. Some of them dropped out halfway through. But we had 11 volunteers, and we interviewed them after day 30, day 60, and day 90. We recorded the interviews, we transcribed them, of course, and then we did a thematic analysis of the data. So this is what we're going to present now.
Okay, so I'm just going to show you the kind of things that came out after our analysis, considering Bouchard's framework of the 4 dimensions that were mentioned earlier. The first one is the algorithmic dimension, and if you remember, this relates to the pedagogical aspects of the learning experience, and include aspects like setting learning objectives, sequencing, so deciding what things to do when, pacing, identifying resources, and assessing progress. Of course, the general goal of the Add1Challenge is to hold a 15-minute conversation at the end of the 90 days, but then individual goals are defined by each learner, depending on, for example, their level of proficiency. Are they a beginner? Are you a beginner or a non-beginner? But also, what is it that you would like to be able to talk about in those 15-minute conversation? What topics are of interest to you, what time you have available to study, etc. So those are the individual goals where each learner will have a degree of autonomy. In terms of the sequencing of learning, in more formal settings, like, for example, a face-to-face course, sequencing, in other words, deciding the order in which you study things, actually is in the hands of the teacher. But in an informal setting, like the Add1Challenge, the learner has much more autonomy in choosing this. For example, at a beginner level, it may be normal to study vocabulary about food or about the house, or how to describe people, etc. But if we look at what this learner says, she's an elementary learner of Arabic, and she said, one new teacher I had a lesson with for the challenge started asking me about my garden and the flowers and vegetables. And in the end, I said, I don't want to talk about my garden and flowers and vegetables. I want to be able to talk with refugees from Syria. That's why she was learning Arabic. And then later on, she said, I've got another lesson tomorrow, and I want to talk about terrorism and Islamophobia. And I was looking up vocabulary for that today. Now, to any teacher of language, this doesn't look like a topic that you would choose for a beginner. It certainly looks much more suitable to an intermediate or even an advanced level of the language. Okay, in terms of pacing, in informal settings, pacing is also, of course, another aspect with regard to which the learner usually exercises a certain degree of control and autonomy. The main risk, of course, is to start off much too fast, carried away by perhaps the enthusiasm of learning a new language or taking part in the challenge, and then not to be able to maintain that rhythm. The organizers of the challenge are adamant to stress that learning to speak a language is a marathon and not a sprint, and this is something that gets emailed right at the beginning of the challenge. And we all know also how important it is to set up a sustainable routine. In the following quote, a participant talks precisely about this problem. And she says, I'm starting to feel that I may not be able to keep up with 45 minutes until the end. I'm thinking about decreasing to half an hour because I'm really not sure I can do it. In the first month, it was fine, and now I don't know if people feel like this. Sometimes I feel like I'm close to burnout. And then later on she says, I feel like I want to keep up, and my mastermind group really helps, so it's towards the end of the week that I start to feel like this. And then Saturday, we meet, and it's like a reburst. And then you continue, because it's a tough routine, I think. You wouldn't do this in your normal life. And I think that's one of the, you can feel the tension there between the intensive nature of the challenge, which is limited to a very limited period of time, it's 90 days, and the importance of setting up a sustainable routine which can be kept also in your normal life. In terms of identifying resources, in self-directed learning, this is again an area where the learner has a certain degree of autonomy, but it's also an area in which autonomous learners can have some difficulty because of the wealth of the resources that are out there. In the Add1Challenge itself creates a kind of structure to compensate for this risk. On the website, for example, there is a list of resources for many different languages compiled by members of the Add1 community. And it also includes the names of teachers or tutors, for example, on italki. So it's not just resources in terms of materials, but also human resources. The study groups are also useful to share resources for specific languages. And then, of course, the Facebook page is used by the community to ask for help in identifying resources and share them when you find them. If we look at evaluation, which was another aspect of this dimension, in formal context, evaluation can be divided into formative and summative assessment. Formative assessment, which is the periodical checkups planned throughout the learning process in order to determine whether it is proceeding in an acceptable fashion, to put it in Bouchard's terms, is present also in informal learning context, usually in the form of self-assessment. In the Add1Challenge, for example, the day 0, 30, 60, and 90 videos can and are often used by the learners more or less consciously as a form of self-assessment in the sense that they are easily compared with earlier performance, and adjustments to learning goals and routines can be made if necessary. So when I asked the question, when you listened to yourself after the day 30 video, did you notice any improvement from the day 0 to one of the participants? She replied, in a sense, it was much longer, because on my day 0, I only did an introduction, which I can do because I do this every time I meet someone new. But on the day 30 video, I kind of spoke about what I did last week, and I tried to use the passive, which I'm not really comfortable with. For me, it was an improvement in the sense that I didn't really prepare. I tried to use some new tenses, some new things, which I don't think I would have tried on day 0. So we can really see the element of self-assessment there by comparison with her day 0 video. Summative assessment is also present in informal learning, and in this case it's present at the end of the challenge, because participants who complete the requirements then can take part in this final selection for the assignment of the prize, and the finalists are required to write a post explaining what they got out of the Add1Challenge. So this is a kind of summative self-assessment at the end of their learning process. Okay, if we move on to the cognitive dimension of self-directed learning, and this concerns the social and the psychological aspects of the learning process, as well as its specific context. And this dimension includes initiative, motive, motivation, context, social environment, past experiences. Initiative, of course, is the driving force that actually sets in motion the learning process. So it's clearly manifested in, for example, joining the Add1Challenge. You wouldn't do that if you didn't have initiative. Motive relates to the more general life goals. Bouchard reminds us that motives precede goals, but must remain explicit throughout the learning process because they are the reason behind it. If we move to motivation, motivation, of course, is a crucial aspect in self-directed learning. And this is very clear in the Add1Challenge. In formal learning context, one of the roles of the teacher is to be able to maintain a high level of motivation in his or her learners. In informal context, however, motivation must come from the learners themselves. And a drop in motivation can lead to discouragement and ultimately to abandonment. Help in maintaining motivation often comes from, for example, succeeding in the different steps of the challenge, in this case, the mini challenges, the periodic videos, but also a successful online lesson or successful exchange can boost your motivation. Motivation is usually divided into intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And every teacher knows that the secret to successful teaching is to have intrinsically motivated students. And many Add1Challengers have that intrinsic motivation to learn their language. The motivation of this particular participant, for example, is very clear. I asked her whether she used a reward or treat when she did well in her L2, and she said, no, because for me, this was my reward, because this is my hobby. I just do it because I like languages. I always wanted to learn French, so it feels like I don't really need a reward for that. It might change with time. I might need one soon, you know, but until now, I've felt that this was kind of my treat anyway, my time for doing something that I like. So clearly, there's a very strong intrinsic motivation there. Extrinsic motivation, on the other hand, comes from outside. It can be as effective as the intrinsic motivation. So if there is no intrinsic motivation, extrinsic motivation can be created as, for example, in the following example, where the learner says the motivating force is, I have paid money to do this, so now I've got to do this. You pay money, you do it, okay, which is the reason why, for example, courses that for a fee tend to have less dropout than courses for free. Okay. The second participant said, I go to the scoreboard. This is where you can see each person's scores. Okay, so that's motivating. You want to be better than the others. And sometimes that helps me. My mastermind group is very consistent, so that we meet every week, every weekend, and they are very motivating. And also I see that they are putting yays, so again, that adds to the motivation. This also motivates me. Or sometimes I just say to myself, okay, I'm going to do this, and I sit down and do it. Okay. If we move to the social environment, another crucial aspect, of course, of the cognitive dimension is the social environment. For participants in the Add1Challenge, the social environment is found within and beyond the Add1Challenge community. And they include also the wider Polyglot community, well-established language exchanges, but also family and friends. As mentioned before, this network of people provide learners with information and advice about learning resources, as well as language practice, of course. However, a fundamental role is also to provide the psychological support that is needed to keep up with the challenge, particularly when things get hard and motivation wanes. The words of this participant illustrate well the role of social environment. She says, I think the Facebook group can be quite helpful. It's the only place where I feel comfortable at bragging a bit. You know, like, I spoke 5 languages today, isn't that amazing? You can post things like that. Other people post it there too. You've got this place where you can celebrate this sort of weird language wins that might sound really obnoxious to anyone else. And you know, there is this target audience of people who are going to really appreciate it. I really like that. And then, when things are not going so well, you can post on there and be like, you know, I've just decided I'm never going to learn Spanish. Everything is too hard. And then there is always this pile-on of encouragement. It's quite nice. So you can really see the two sides of the coin here. Okay. In terms of previous learning experience, this affects the way in which learners make informed choices for their future learning. So although the Add1Challenge comes into what we call informal learning, past experiences may have taken place in informal but also informal contexts, for example, studying at university or even at school. And these experiences provide not only a source of materials, but more significantly of learning strategies and awareness about what works and what doesn't work for the individual learner. And if we look at the answers to the question about previous learning experience from the initial questionnaire, we can see that 50% of the participants have up to between 1 and 3 years of online learning experience. The question was about online learning experience. Okay. Less than 10% have no prior online experience. Of course, if we had asked about previous language learning experience tout court, not just online, then we would probably have got 100% who would have said that they have previous learning experience. In terms of language learning in particular, and the kind of things that the students have, the participants, have experience of, we can see actually, I hope you can see well, but right at the bottom, we have over 90% of the participants who have experience learning languages using language mobile apps such as Duolingo, Busuru, Memrise, etc. And also learning languages by using films, TVs, videos, Netflix, and whatever. So over 90% have experience of this. But then we also have 80% who have experience self-taught online independently and also self-taught with books independently. So it's not just online learning here, it's also learning with books. 80% of participants have experience of that. And 60% have experience learning languages with a one-to-one teacher online, for example, on Skype, and the same for face-to-face language courses from, say, a university of other language providers. So this would be formal learning. So we can see that the numbers are quite telling in what kind of experience they have. Okay, let's move now very quickly to the last of the 4 dimensions, which was the the third dimension, one before last, but we have another one left. The semiotic dimension, in other words, the use of resources. We found that learners use a huge array of different resources, both traditional and, as we saw in the previous slide, also printed books. Traditional resources using grammar books, printed online courses, etc. Also online resources, both free and for a fee. In addition, they also make use of their own social networks, including family and friends, as well as the social network provided by the Add1Challenge to find teachers and partners to practice with. We also found that while some participants were keen to explore new resources, other more experienced learners were also interested in pursuing a more comprehensive and structured approach provided by more traditional resources, such as printed course books and grammar books. This may be due to the realization of the difficulty of putting such disparate resources into a coherent learning program by themselves. We move on to the last dimension.
Yes, so the final dimension was the economic dimension. And remember that Bouchard was particularly interested in this sort of learning online and in network settings. And what he says, of course, is that these settings offer innumerable resources and also a thriving online marketplace where you can find teachers, you can find partners, and so on. And in this new world, which Martin Weller has called a pedagogy of abundance, is really the challenging the traditional pedagogies of scarcity that we have been used to, where actually it was just the sort of universities and language schools and publishers of materials that in a way had the power to produce the resources and the learning opportunities. So one might assume actually that if there are so much free stuff, so in this pedagogy of abundance, that the cost of learning is virtually zero. And of course it isn't. First of all, in order to do the challenge, you have to pay a fee. It's a $100 fee. But then, so there's that sort of initial financial commitment. And what's interesting is that a lot of the learners actually had done the challenge 2, 3, 4, 5 more times. So obviously this sort of financial commitment for them was worth it. And as Anna was saying as well, there was also the financial commitment of actually buying resources to structure their learning. So they bought course books, things like that. They signed up to italki lessons and so on. The other aspect that Bouchard was interested in is also the value, so not just the cost, but the value. And if we have a look at the reasons for doing the challenge that participants told us right at the beginning, you'll see from the bottom that the main reason is personal interest, then also trying new approaches to learning and to challenge oneself. Those were the main motivating forces for doing the challenge. And just a couple of slides from the quotes from our learners. So one of them said, for instance, I think that what you put into this challenge is what you get out of it. Like in the first challenge I did, I was putting in the times and the hours, and that really made the progression. So people are very aware that there's that sort of, value of the challenge that is expanded by actually investing in it yourself in terms of time and energy and so on. But then there's also the understanding that sometimes some things are not worth it, are not worth the effort. So the second one says, probably what I'm putting in, I'm getting out. I mean, some things I decided aren't worth the investment. I was putting every new word on flashcards, and then I thought, no, this isn't useful. This is not a worthwhile use of my time. So there's very much that sense of, what are the things that are worth doing and what are the things that are not worth investing time and money on. But of course, in terms of value, Anna mentioned a quote of a student who was talking a little bit about this, but here's another one. What is the real value of the Add1Challenge is this idea of satisfaction. So what do you think you're getting out of the Add1Challenge? A lot of satisfaction. I always like to have some kind of personal project on the go, something I do just by myself, and something that keeps me busy and gives me something interesting to think about, so definitely that. I really enjoy talking to people, and I think this challenge made me enjoy that even more, because I find it really satisfying and it puts me in a better mood, I think, if I talk more to others. Okay, so for her, the value of the challenge is even beyond learning the language, is also being part of a community of people that, you know, share the same interests and with whom she can talk. Okay, so we just wanted to finish with some recommendations, and they're not so much recommendations for people who might think of doing the challenge, but really for recommendations for anyone who is learning on their own, based on what these learners have told us about their self-directed learning. And really what I would say is, first of all, understand what learning on your own, understand what self-directed learning involves, and think actively about all aspects of it. So think about your motivation, think about your aims, and also, obviously, about the resources, both in terms of materials, but also in terms of people that you might need to fulfill those aims. Think about how to draw from your prior learning experiences in terms of, for instance, your learning strategies that you have used in the past that have worked for you, and the resources that you know work for you. But also be able to critically evaluate them. So if there are things that are not working, then don't do them, or think of doing them differently. I think very, very importantly, that came through a lot in our participants, is the issue of pacing and avoiding burnout. I think it's very tempting to throw yourself into something and develop a routine that is not sustainable in the longer term. And then, obviously, think about evaluating your progress, because this actually really helps with motivation. Obviously, think about the role of the community. We have a fantastic community here of polyglots, so, you know, tap into that community for support, for advice, and so on. But also communities elsewhere, so your family, your friends, people who can support you in your learning. And then, obviously, just to finish with, think about the fact that you get out as much as you put in. So, muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I was wondering what the sample size of your population is and the demographics.
So the sample size, as I said, there were 70 people doing the challenge, that particular challenge at the time. We had about a third of them who responded to the questionnaire, and the people that we interviewed were 11 of the 70 odd.
And what were, like, age, gender distribution?
From about 20 to late 70s. Mostly women. There were a couple of blokes.
Two men.
Yeah.
Okay, and you said something like people who tended to be more experienced use certain types of materials. How did you evaluate that?
The people who had told us that they had been, for example, doing several challenges, so that it was not their first challenge, and people who told us about their language learning experience, somebody who had studied several languages throughout many years, so in that sense, more experienced, who were not at the beginning of language learning.
I think there was just one learner who had very little prior experience of learning languages. So they all told us about their experience at university, at school, and so on, and throughout their lives.
More anecdotal interviews. Okay, got it.
So of the 11 people that you were studying, how many dropped out of the challenge?
We don't know. We don't actually have those figures. Those are figures that the organizers have.
Out of 11?
So I don't really know.
You don't know how many people out of 11
It's a question you can ask Benny.
Okay. And the group that you were studying, the 11 people, did you compare them to any other groups, or was you just looking at this group?
We were just looking at this group.
Okay.
Yeah. But out of the group of 11, 2 dropped out.
2? Yeah. 2. And out of the 70, do you know how many? You don't know.
I suspect quite a few more, but...
Okay. So only 2 of the 11 dropped out.
But then again, I guess the fact that they took part in the study also means that they were probably incredibly well motivated anyway. So it's always, you know, not necessarily a representative sample of everybody who was in the challenge. Yeah.
And in fact, it would have been interesting to interview the people who had dropped out.
But that is very, very difficult to do.
It's very difficult to get hold of them.
I've worked a lot, for instance, in MOOCs where you have huge dropout rates, and it's virtually impossible to find the people who drop out, basically because they don't want to talk to you. I think there's that feeling of, I have failed this, and therefore I just want to move on and not talk about it. Yeah.
When When I was preparing for this conference, I had attempted some Icelandic, and in that process, I did put 2 videos on Facebook, hoping to get some critique from it. And I'm not part of the Add1Challenge, by the way, I'm sorry. But, I had several Icelandic speakers, some native and not, who came on and gave me a great deal of encouragement. You know, keep going, good job. What I didn't get was, these were your mistakes, and this is what you could have done better. And I'm curious, do you have that problem in your groups, and what have you done to solve that, if you have?
No, I think actually this is something that is not just limited to language learning, and it's certainly not limited to the Add1Challenge. I think very often we expect as language learners what we'd like is for people to correct everything we say so that we can progress, etc., etc. But actually, if you put yourself on the side of the sort of native speaker listening to this, actually, you know, the mistakes are perhaps less important. They're not language teachers who are there to correct your language and explain the rules to you. You know, they're enthusiastic about the fact that you want to learn their language, and that's what they're conveying. So perhaps it was an unfair expectation on them that they would then proceed to analyze what you said and give you that kind of feedback, which, you know, if you want that, I think you should ask a teacher about that. You know, it's, when you talk to people normally outside, you know, and people don't actually stop you and say, well, actually, you know, you made this mistake because we use this form. You know, no, they just respond to the content of what you've said, and they're interested in the conversation. They're not interested in, you know, giving you sort of linguistic feedback in the way that as learners, of course, we would like to receive as well. So maybe it was just not the place to expect that kind of feedback.